The certificate sat on the coffee table between us, official letterhead, a doctor's signature at the bottom that I still couldn't quite reconcile with the man I thought I knew. "You need someone managing things now, Arthur," Gregory said, his voice carrying the same measured, reasonable tone he used in courtrooms, the tone designed to make disagreement feel unreasonable before you'd even had the chance to voice it. "This isn't about taking anything from you. It's for your own protection." Claire stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself, unable to meet my eyes the way she used to when she was 7 years old, and had done something she knew was wrong but hadn't yet found the courage to admit it. I looked down at the document. Diagnosis: significant cognitive decline, consistent with early-stage dementia. My own name typed beneath it, my own life reduced to a single paragraph a man I'd known for years had signed, apparently, without ever once asking me to complete a single memory test I could actually remember taking. For my protection, I repeated quietly. "Dad, please," Claire said, her voice small. "We just want to make sure everything's handled properly. That's all this is." I thought about 40 years standing in front of lecture halls, explaining to 18-year-olds the difference between what a document says and what it actually does. How power moves quietly through paperwork long before anyone notices it's moved at all. I'd taught that lesson 1,000 times. I hadn't expected, at 75, to be living inside an example of it. "Gregory," I said, "do you remember the letter I wrote for you 15 years ago to the admissions committee?" Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not yet, but close enough to its neighborhood. "Of course I remember," he said carefully. "Arthur, this isn't—" "I know exactly what this is," I said. I reached toward the drawer of the side table beside my chair, the same drawer where I'd been quietly keeping something for the better part of 2 years. Something neither of them had ever thought to ask about, because neither of them had ever thought it mattered. I set a thick manila envelope on the table, directly beside their certificate. Claire's eyes moved to it, confusion crossing her face. "Dad, what is that?" I smiled, the particular smile I used to give a graduate student who'd just asked a question they thought was simple, not yet understanding how large the answer was about to be. "Sit down," I said. "Both of you. I think it's time you understood exactly what I've been doing while you assumed I was losing my mind. If you found this story tonight, I'm glad you did. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you'd think to know real people are on the other end of this." A brief note before I continue. This story blends fiction with purpose, crafted for entertainment and the lessons worth carrying home. Names and details are coincidental. What you take away from it, though, is entirely yours to keep. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. There is a version of this story Gregory would tell if you asked him. In his version, I imagine, he is a devoted son-in-law making difficult decisions for a father-in-law who could no longer make them for himself. I understand why he might believe that version, or at least why he might need to. It's easier to live inside a story where you're protecting someone than one where you're taking something from them. Neither version is entirely mine to correct on his behalf, but I can tell you my own, plainly, the way I've spent 40 years teaching students to examine evidence before drawing conclusions from it. My name is Arthur Whitmore. I'm 75 years old. For 40 years, I taught constitutional history and legal theory at university, and in that time I wrote 6 textbooks that are still, as far as I know, sitting on shelves in law libraries across this country. I was never a wealthy man by the standards of the profession I taught about, but I built something that outlasts most fortunes, a body of work, and a reputation, built one careful argument at a time. I raised Claire to value honesty above comfort. I thought she understood that. Some part of her still does, I believe, though it took a great deal in the last 2 years to be reminded of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this actually began. Not with a diagnosis. Not with a certificate signed by a man who never properly examined me. Let me start 15 years ago, in my old office at the university, with a young man sitting across from my desk, asking for a favor that would change the shape of his entire life. Gregory came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 15 years ago, wearing a suit that looked slightly too large on him, the way a young man's suit does when he's borrowed his father's confidence along with his blazer. He was dating Claire at the time, still a year away from proposing, and I remember being struck, that afternoon, by how nervous he seemed, not about Claire, but about something else entirely, something he was working up the courage to ask me directly. "Professor Whitmore," he said, "I know this is an unusual request, and I understand if you say no." His law school application had been rejected the previous spring. Good grades, strong work ethic, but an LSAT score that fell just below the threshold the admissions committee typically required, and a transcript that showed, in his words, a slow start during a difficult period after his own father's death partway through his undergraduate years. "I've been given a second chance to reapply," he said. "But I need something to help the committee see past the numbers. I need someone they respect to vouch for who I actually am, not just what the transcript says. I want to be honest about why I said yes, because I think it matters for everything that came after. I didn't write that letter simply because Gregory was dating my daughter, though that was certainly part of it. I wrote it because I'd spent enough years reading admissions files to recognize the difference between a student who was fundamentally unprepared and a young man who'd been knocked sideways by grief at exactly the wrong moment in his academic life. I spent 3 evenings on that letter. I want you to understand what it cost me professionally. Recommendation letters from senior faculty carry weight precisely because they're not handed out carelessly. And I'd built 30 years of credibility with that particular law school's admissions committee by being judicious about exactly when I chose to spend it. I spent a significant portion of that credibility on Gregory Bell, a 24-year-old I'd known for less than a year, because I believed, genuinely, that he deserved the chance. He was admitted the following spring. He called me himself to tell me, his voice cracking with a gratitude I don't think I'd ever heard from him before, or, if I'm honest, particularly often after. "I won't forget this, Professor," he told me. "Whatever you ever need, I mean it. I owe you everything." I remember telling him, gently, that he didn't owe me anything, that the point of using influence well is that you don't expect it repaid, only that it's used to build something worth the investment. He married Claire 2 years later. I stood up at their wedding and gave a toast about second chances, about how the people who matter most in our lives are rarely the ones who never stumbled, but the ones who got back up with someone believing in them. I didn't know, standing at that podium, that 15 years later, I would be the one who needed someone to believe in me, and that the man I'd once vouched for would be the one deciding whether I still deserved to be believed. Margaret passed 6 years ago, on a quiet Sunday morning, in the bedroom of the house we'd shared for 38 years. Cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say most of what needs saying, though never quite enough time to say all of it. I stayed in that house alone for the first 4 years after she died, surrounded by her books and her handwriting in the margins of mine, and for the most part, I managed well enough. I still lectured occasionally as an emeritus professor. I still corresponded with former students. I still most days felt entirely like myself. The memory lapses started small, the way they do for most people my age, I imagine. A colleague's name that took a moment too long to surface. An appointment I double-booked once, then twice. Nothing that alarmed me particularly. The ordinary friction of a 74-year-old mind that had simply logged a great many years of information and occasionally took its time retrieving the right file. Claire noticed before I did, or at least she noticed with more concern than I gave it myself. She suggested, gently, that I might be more comfortable living with her and Gregory, closer to family, less alone in a house that had grown too large and too quiet for one person. I agreed, mostly because I missed the sound of another life moving through a house, the particular comfort of not eating dinner alone every night. It was Gregory who insisted on the medical evaluation. Just to be thorough, Arthur, he said, for everyone's peace of mind. Dr. Holloway's office was efficient, professional, entirely unremarkable in the way most medical appointments are. I answered questions, drew a clock face when asked, recited a short list of words I was meant to remember 5 minutes later. I remember thinking at the time that the appointment felt somewhat rushed. 20 minutes, perhaps less, for an evaluation I'd have expected to take considerably longer given what was ultimately at stake. 2 weeks later, Gregory handed me a printed summary of the results. Significant cognitive decline. Early-stage dementia. I remember reading those words in my own living room, in a chair I'd sat in for years, feeling the particular vertigo of being told, definitively, by someone with the authority to say it, that the mind I'd trusted my entire professional life might no longer be reliable. I didn't argue at the time. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, confronted with a credentialed diagnosis, simply accepted it the way you accept a verdict from someone whose job it is to know things you don't. I didn't know yet that Gregory had spoken with Dr. Holloway privately before that appointment, framing the visit not as a routine check, but as something closer to a formality he needed completed quickly, for reasons that had very little to do with my actual well-being. I only found that out much later. By then, a great deal had already quietly changed. Once the diagnosis existed on paper, everything else began shifting with a quiet efficiency I didn't fully register until I looked back at it later, all at once, the way you only see a staircase's full descent from the bottom. Gregory offered to help manage the royalty payments from my textbooks first. It made sense on the surface. 6 books, still assigned in law programs across the country, generated a modest but steady stream of income that had grown slightly complicated to track over the decades. "Let me take that off your plate," he said. "One less thing to worry about." I agreed. I had no particular reason not to. He was a practicing attorney, competent with contracts and finances in a way I'd never claimed to be myself. The medical decisions came next, framed the same reasonable way. Gregory began attending my doctor's appointments, speaking on my behalf when I paused too long searching for a word, answering questions before I'd finished forming my own response. I noticed it happening. I didn't fully understand, in the moment, what it meant that I was noticing it and saying nothing. Then came the visitors. A former colleague called to invite me to a faculty retirement dinner, and Claire, apologetically, explained that Gregory thought it might be overstimulating, given everything. A former student wrote asking to visit and discuss a research project, and somehow the invitation never quite made it back to me until months later, by which point the opportunity had passed. I want to be fair to Claire in all of this. I don't believe she understood, not fully, what was happening around her. She loved me, genuinely. I never doubted that, not for a single day of any of this. I believe she trusted her husband's judgment the way a wife trusts a husband. She has no particular reason to doubt, and I believe that trust made her slower than she should have been to notice what I was noticing. What I was noticing, slowly, was this. The diagnosis on that piece of paper had become less a medical fact and more a kind of master key, unlocking Gregory's access to nearly every decision that touched my life, while the actual, day-to-day evidence of my own mind, my ability to read, to write, to hold a complex argument together across pages, remained, as far as I could tell, entirely intact. I still read for 2 hours every morning. I still corresponded, in careful longhand, with 3 former doctoral students about their ongoing research. I still, in the quiet of my study each evening, wrote, steadily, methodically, page after page of something I hadn't yet told anyone about. I began to understand, somewhere in that second year, that I wasn't losing my mind at all. I was simply the only one in that house who still seemed to be using his. Before I go any further, let me pause here for a moment. If you're still with me, drop a comment below and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think to know there are real people listening on the other end of this. A quick reminder, this story blends fictional elements into its storytelling, crafted for reflection as much as entertainment. If it isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what I was building quietly in that study is the part that changed everything. I want to explain something about memory that I don't think Gregory, or Dr. Holloway, or even Claire fully understood in those 2 years. Short-term recall and long-term cognitive capacity are not the same faculty, and a decline in one does not automatically indicate a decline in the other. I taught complex legal theory for 40 years. I understood, better than most people in that house, exactly what a genuine cognitive decline looks like from the inside, and I understood, with growing clarity, that whatever I was experiencing bore only a loose resemblance to it. I began writing a memoir roughly 2 years before that evening in the living room. I hadn't planned it, not exactly. It started as an exercise Margaret and I had once discussed doing together, years before her diagnosis, a record of the two of us, the university, the strange and wonderful accident of a working-class scholarship student meeting a young librarian in 1974 and building an entire life out of it. I wrote every evening after dinner, in the same study where I'd written 6 textbooks over 4 decades. Gregory noticed the manuscript pages accumulating on my desk once or twice, and dismissed it, kindly enough, as something to keep Arthur occupied. The particular condescension reserved for hobbies belonging to people whose judgment you've already quietly decided not to trust. He never asked to read a page of it. If he had, he might have noticed what any careful reader would have noticed immediately. The prose was dense, precise, structurally sophisticated in exactly the way my academic writing had always been. Whatever was happening to my short-term memory, it had not touched the part of my mind that had spent 40 years building careful, complicated arguments. By the 18-month mark, I had nearly 400 pages. I made a decision, quietly, without telling Claire or Gregory, to reach out to David Osai. David had been my personal attorney for over a decade, handling small matters, my will, a property dispute years earlier, the occasional contract review. I trusted him completely, and, just importantly, he had no relationship whatsoever with Gregory, no professional overlap, nothing that would create even the faintest temptation to share what I told him. "I need you to do something for me," I told him, "and I need it done quietly, without anyone in my family knowing, until I decide it's time for them to know." David listened, the way good lawyers listen, without interrupting. "Tell me what you need, Arthur," he said. I told him, and 3 weeks later, my memoir was sitting on the desk of an editor at one of the largest publishing houses in New York. The publisher's response came faster than I expected. 6 weeks after David sent the manuscript, an editor named Patricia Voss called to tell me, in a voice that carried genuine enthusiasm rather than polite professional courtesy, that they wanted to acquire it, and that the advance they were prepared to offer was substantial, considerably more than I'd allowed myself to hope for. "Professor Whitmore," she said, "I want to be honest with you. Academic memoirs rarely generate this kind of interest internally. But this isn't really an academic memoir. It's a love story and a history of a discipline and a meditation on aging and memory, all at once. The prose is remarkable." I sat in my study for a long moment after that call, looking at the 400 pages I'd written in secret over 2 years, feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. The particular, quiet vindication of proof arriving exactly when it was needed most. David drafted the contract carefully, routing every clause through his own office rather than mine, ensuring that Gregory would have no visibility into the arrangement, no legal standing to interfere with it, and no advance knowledge that it existed at all. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in his office, a room Gregory had never once set foot in. "There's one more thing I think you should do," David said, once the contract was finalized. "If Gregory ever tries to formalize that guardianship claim, you're going to want more than a manuscript to counter a medical diagnosis. You're going to want another diagnosis." That was how I came to call Ellen Park. Ellen had been one of my doctoral students decades earlier, back when she was still deciding between a career in legal academia and one in medicine. She'd ultimately chosen medicine, specializing in neurology, and had built, over the following 25 years, a considerable reputation in cognitive assessment. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, mostly through holiday cards and the occasional conference where our paths crossed. I called her office and explained, as plainly as I could, what had happened, the rushed evaluation, the diagnosis I'd never been given the chance to fully understand or question, the way it had been used, quietly, to reshape control over nearly every part of my life. "Arthur," she said, her voice sharpening with the particular focus of someone who suddenly understood the situation was more serious than a routine consultation. "I want to see you myself, properly. A full assessment, not the 20-minute version it sounds like you were given." She flew in from Chicago the following week and spent nearly 3 hours with me. Extensive cognitive testing, a thorough neurological workup, a careful review of Dr. Holloway's original report. When she finished, she sat across from me with an expression I recognized from decades of watching her analyze difficult problems as a student. "Arthur," she said, "your original evaluation doesn't meet any reasonable clinical standard. The testing was incomplete, rushed, and frankly, some of the documented responses don't match what I just observed in you at all. Whatever is happening with your memory, it is mild, ordinary, age-appropriate, and it does not remotely support a diagnosis of significant cognitive decline, let alone dementia." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I think someone wanted this diagnosis to say more than it should have," she said, "and I think you deserve to know exactly who benefited from that." I didn't confront Gregory the moment Ellen delivered her findings. I want to explain why, because it matters for what came after. 40 years of teaching taught me something about timing that I don't think Gregory, for all his legal training, had ever fully absorbed. The strength of an argument depends enormously on when you choose to present it. A true thing, said too early, can be dismissed, minimized, explained away by someone with more immediate leverage than you have. The same true thing, held quietly until the moment it can't be dismissed, becomes something else entirely. I asked Ellen to write up her findings formally, with full documentation, and to be prepared, if needed, to present them in person. I asked David to have the publishing contract ready to produce as physical proof, undeniable and already executed, immune to any objection Gregory might try to raise after the fact. And I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks after Ellen's visit, Gregory told me at dinner that he thought it was time to formalize things properly, a financial and medical guardianship drafted by his own firm that would give him full legal authority over my affairs. He framed it, as he always did, as an act of care. "It protects you, Arthur," he said, "and honestly, it protects Claire too, from having to make difficult decisions alone if things progress." I watched Claire's face while he said it. She didn't look at me. She looked at her plate, the particular posture of someone who has decided, consciously or not, that it's easier to trust her husband's framing than to sit with her own uncertainty about it. "When would you like to do this?" I asked, my voice even. "This weekend," Gregory said. "I've already had the paperwork drawn up. It's mostly a formality at this point." "This weekend then," I agreed. I spent the days before that meeting the way I used to spend the days before an important lecture, organizing my materials, anticipating objections, deciding exactly how each piece of evidence should be presented for maximum clarity. I called Ellen and confirmed she could be at the house Saturday afternoon, ready to arrive precisely when I needed her. I placed the publishing contract, along with a printed copy of Ellen's full clinical report, in a manila envelope, and I set it in the drawer of the side table beside my chair, the same chair I'd been sitting in for 6 years, since Margaret's illness first made the living room the center of our daily life instead of my study. I thought, more than once in those final days, about the letter I'd written for Gregory 15 years earlier, the credibility I'd spent on a young man I believed deserved a second chance. I found myself hoping, even then, even knowing what I knew, that some version of the man I'd vouched for still existed underneath whoever he'd become. I would find out, that Saturday, exactly how much of him remained. Saturday afternoon arrived exactly the way I'd planned it. Gregory with his folder of guardianship paperwork, Claire beside him, uncertain in a way that had become almost permanent over the last 2 years, and me, seated in my chair, the manila envelope already resting in the drawer beside me. Gregory laid the guardianship documents on the coffee table with the same practiced confidence he'd brought to every conversation in this house for the past 2 years. "This just formalizes what's already been happening informally, Arthur. It protects everyone." "Before I sign anything," I said, "I think there's something you should both see first." I opened the drawer and set the envelope on the table beside his paperwork. "Inside that," I said, "is a signed publishing contract with one of the largest houses in New York for a 400-page memoir I have been writing entirely on my own for the past 2 years. I want you to notice the date on that contract, Gregory. It was executed 11 months after your diagnosis." Claire reached for it first, her hands unsteady as she opened the folder and began scanning the pages. "Dad, I don't understand," she said quietly. "You wrote, this whole time you were—" "I was exactly who I've always been," I said. "Writing. Thinking. The only thing that changed in this house over the last 2 years wasn't my mind, Claire. It was who was allowed to see evidence of it." Gregory's face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid calculations he doesn't like the results of. That was when the doorbell rang, precisely on schedule. Ellen walked in with the same composed authority she'd carried since her days as my most promising doctoral student, a folder of her own tucked under one arm. "Arthur asked me to be here today," she said, addressing Gregory and Claire directly. "I conducted a full neurological and cognitive assessment 3 weeks ago. I'd like to walk you both through what I found, and through what I found lacking in Dr. Halloway's original evaluation." She laid out the findings plainly: the incomplete testing, the rushed timeline, the significant discrepancies between the documented results, and what any reasonable clinical standard would require before reaching a diagnosis as serious as the one Gregory had built 2 years of control around. "In my professional opinion," Ellen said, closing her folder, "the original diagnosis does not hold up to scrutiny. Arthur's cognitive function is well within the normal range for a man his age. Whatever this guardianship agreement is meant to formalize is not formalizing a medical necessity." Claire looked up from the publishing contract, then at her husband, something shifting visibly behind her eyes. "Gregory," she said slowly, "did you already know this? Did you know Dad was fine?" Gregory didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. the same way silence had answered for him at that Sunday dinner table 2 years earlier when he first insisted on the evaluation. Gregory sat very still for a long moment, the guardianship paperwork still spread across the coffee table, suddenly looking less like a formality and more like exactly what it had always been. "I need you both to understand something," he said finally, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard from him since the day he called to tell me about his law school acceptance 15 years earlier. My firm, we've been struggling. Badly. I made some bad investments 2 years ago, right around the time Margaret's estate was finalized, and I needed capital. I told myself managing your royalties, having some financial oversight, it was temporary, just until things stabilized. Claire's hand went to her mouth. "You used Dad's textbook money to cover your firm's losses?" "I was going to pay it back," Gregory said, and even as the words left him, he seemed to hear how thin they sounded. I never meant for the diagnosis to become what it became. Holloway owed me a favor from a case years ago. I asked him to move quickly on the evaluation because I needed the guardianship paperwork in place before certain payments came due. I told myself Arthur was declining anyway, that I was just accelerating something that would have happened regardless. He came around the table then, and for the first time in 2 years, I watched something in him crack open completely, not the composed, reasonable attorney who'd been running this house decisions from behind a veneer of care, but the frightened young man who'd once sat across my desk 15 years earlier, asking for a second chance he hadn't believed he deserved. He knelt in front of my chair, the same way he must have imagined, once kneeling to propose to Claire. "Arthur, I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking apart. "You believed in me when no one else would. You spent your own credibility on a 24-year-old you barely knew, and I repaid that by using a fabricated diagnosis to take control of your life. Because I was too ashamed to admit I'd failed at my own. I don't have any excuse that makes this smaller than it is." I looked down at my son-in-law, 46 years old, unraveling in front of me the way a man does when the story he's been telling himself finally stops holding together. I thought about that letter I wrote 15 years ago. I thought about standing at his wedding, toasting second chances. I thought about how easily a debt of gratitude can curdle, quietly, into something closer to resentment when a person can't find a way to feel they've ever fully repaid it. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt, Gregory," I said quietly. "It does. More than the diagnosis itself, if I'm honest. I could have forgiven confusion. I'm having a much harder time forgiving deception." Claire was crying now, looking between her husband and her father, caught in the particular grief of watching two people she loved arrive at a reckoning she hadn't seen coming. Before I go on, let me pause here for a moment. If this story has reached you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me. What would you have done? Sitting in that chair, watching someone you'd once believed in unravel in front of you. I read every comment, and it means more than you'd think to hear from you. A gentle reminder, this story carries fictional elements, woven in for reflection as much as entertainment. If that isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what came after that Saturday afternoon is the part I still think about most. Gregory withdrew the guardianship petition himself the following Monday, formally and in writing, copying both David and Ellen on the correspondence, so there could be no ambiguity about it later. He also contacted Dr. Holloway directly, insisting the original diagnosis be formally retracted and corrected in my medical record, a conversation that, I understand, cost him a friendship he'd had for over a decade, and very nearly cost Holloway his standing with the state medical board once the circumstances came fully to light. Gregory's law firm situation became public knowledge not long after, in the quieter way these things usually surface. A partner dispute, an ethics inquiry, the kind of professional unraveling that happens slowly, and then, seemingly all at once. I didn't take any satisfaction in watching it happen. I want to be honest about that. I'd spent too many years hoping for the best version of him to feel much beyond a tired, complicated sadness as the rest of it came apart. Claire and Gregory separated 3 months later, not explosively, but the way a structure settles, once you finally remove whatever had been quietly propping it up in a way it was never meant to be propped. Claire moved back into my house with me, an arrangement that felt, this time, entirely different from the one Gregory had orchestrated 2 years earlier. This time, it was simply a father and daughter, rebuilding something honest between them. The memoir published 7 months after that Saturday afternoon. I used a portion of the advance, along with the accumulated royalties Gregory had been managing, to establish a scholarship in Margaret's name at the university library science program, where she'd once studied. Something I'd been quietly planning since long before any of this began, a project she and I had discussed together years earlier, before her diagnosis made those kinds of long conversations harder to have. Ellen still calls every few months, no longer as my doctor, simply as an old friend checking in. David remains my attorney, and I trust him, if anything, more than I did before. I think, most days, about the letter I wrote 15 years ago, and whether I'd write it again knowing everything I know now. I believe even now that I would. I still write every evening in my study, though these days it's mostly correspondence, and lately notes toward a second book, something about memory itself, about what it actually means to lose a piece of your mind versus simply losing the trust of the people around you. The tall bookshelf in the corner still holds the same 6 textbooks I wrote across 4 decades of teaching, their spines worn, soft from years of student hands. Beside them now sits a 7th book, the memoir, its cover simple and unassuming, the way I'd wanted it to be. Claire keeps a copy on her own nightstand. She tells me she reads a chapter most nights before sleep, even the chapters about her mother that are hardest to sit with. Gregory reached out once, several months after the separation, not asking for anything, simply writing a long letter of his own, an apology more complete than the one he'd offered kneeling on my living room floor, an acknowledgement of everything he'd taken and everything it had cost. I haven't decided yet what to do with that letter, whether it's the beginning of something worth rebuilding, or simply the closing of something that needed closing properly. I've learned at 75 that not every question needs an immediate answer. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: the mind that matters most in protecting yourself isn't the one other people diagnose on your behalf. It's the one you keep quietly, patiently using, even when the people around you have already decided, for their own reasons, that you've stopped being capable of using it at all. I'm not a perfect father, and I wasn't a perfect judge of character 15 years ago, at that university desk. I trusted first and verified far too late. The same mistake I've watched other fathers in this world make, in different shapes, for reasons that always feel, in the moment, like love. If you see any piece of yourself in this story tonight, if someone has ever used your own vulnerability, real or invented, as a doorway into control they were never entitled to, I hope you find the resolve to keep your own evidence close, quietly, patiently, until the moment it matters most. Wisdom was never about remembering every name, every date, every small detail life eventually blurs at the edges. It was always about knowing, clearly, who actually deserves your trust, and having the quiet resolve to prove it, on your own terms, when the moment finally requires it. This is what a quiet revenge dad means to me. Not cruelty, not anger, just a father who kept writing quietly until the truth was strong enough to speak entirely for itself. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. A last gentle note: some upcoming stories on this channel contain fictional elements, crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that isn't for you, no hard feelings.